The Grand Palazzo Rossetti was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small the moment they walked through its doors. The ceilings were so high that the chandeliers looked like fallen stars hanging in the air. The marble floors were so polished that guests could almost see their own reflections looking back at them. Every corner of the hall was filled with the soft sound of classical music, the gentle clinking of crystal glasses, and the low murmur of people who believed they were the most important people in the world. It was the night of Milan's most talked-about charity gala. The guest list read like a directory of wealth and influence. Business owners in tailored suits stood next to city officials in borrowed confidence. Women in beautiful dresses moved gracefully from one conversation to the next. Waiters in white gloves carried trays of drinks without making a single sound. Everything was perfect. Everything was polished. Everything was exactly the way it was supposed to look. Sofia Marchetti did not belong there. At least, that was what everyone who noticed her thought. She sat alone at table 14, a small round table near the service corridor at the far edge of the hall. It was the kind of table that the organizers placed on the list only because someone had cancelled at the last minute and the chair needed to be filled. Sofia had been given the seat by a colleague who could not attend. She had said yes without much thought, and she had arrived on time, alone, wearing a simple dark dress that had nothing remarkable about it. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She wore no earrings, no necklace, no bracelet. Her bag was plain and small. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she looked around the room with quiet, steady eyes. She did not check her phone. She did not fidget with her napkin. She did not try to catch anyone's attention. She simply watched. To anyone who glanced her way, she was nobody. A seat filler. A minor city employee who had somehow wandered into a room where she had no business being. But Sofia was watching everything. Across the hall, at the large central table that had been set apart from all the others like a throne in the middle of a ballroom, sat Luca Ferrante. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and dark hair that was cut precisely. He wore his suit the way powerful men always wore their clothes, like the fabric had been made specifically for him and could never belong to anyone else. He laughed at the right moments, leaned in when someone spoke to show that he was listening, and kept one eye on the room at all times. He was the kind of man who never truly relaxed, because relaxing was something other people did. Everyone in the room knew who Luca Ferrante was. He was the head of one of the oldest and most influential families in Milan. On paper, his business empire stretched across real estate, construction, and philanthropy. He funded hospitals. He donated to schools. He gave generously to the very charity that was hosting tonight's gala. He was admired. He was celebrated. He was, to the people in that room, a great man. What most of them either did not know or chose not to ask about was everything that existed below the surface of all that generosity. The contracts that were won through pressure. The money that moved through companies with no real address. The decisions that were made in quiet rooms and never written down. Luca Ferrante had built his life carefully and kept it clean on the outside, and he had done it for long enough that he had started to believe no one would ever look too closely. He was comfortable in that belief tonight. He was in the middle of an important conversation with a man named Greco, a property developer who had been brought to the gala specifically to finalize a construction deal worth 50 million euros. The deal had taken months to arrange. Tonight was the night it would be closed. Luca was in a good mood, and when Luca was in a good mood, he expected the world to match his energy. That was when he noticed the woman at table 14. It was not that she was doing anything wrong. She was simply sitting there. But there was something about the way she sat, the complete absence of effort, the way she did not look around the room with hunger or nervousness or the need to be seen, that caught the edge of his attention. In a room full of people performing their importance, she was the only one who was not performing anything at all. He leaned toward his right-hand man, Marco, who had been standing a few steps behind him all evening. "Who is that woman?" he asked, nodding slightly in her direction. Marco was a careful man. He noticed things quietly and said little. He had survived 2 decades beside Luca by being exactly that way. He looked across the room, then at the printed guest list in his jacket pocket. "Sofia Marchetti," he said. "Junior administrator at the City Health Board. She was added to fill a seat. She has no connection to anyone here." Luca looked at her again. He told himself it was nothing. But something about her stillness bothered him in a way he could not name. It felt, unreasonably, like she was the one watching the room and everyone else was the one being observed. He pushed the thought aside and returned to his conversation. An hour later, the music softened and the formal dinner gave way to a cocktail reception. Guests rose from their tables and moved freely around the hall. Small groups formed and shifted. The room became warmer and louder, and the air filled with the smell of perfume and wine and the particular confidence that comes from being in a room where no one challenges you. Sophia rose from her table and walked to the far end of the hall, near one of the tall windows that looked out over the city. Standing there was Contessa Ilara di Fontana, an elderly woman in a deep blue dress, her white hair pinned up with the kind of elegance that cannot be learned but only lived into over many decades. The Contessa was one of the most respected figures in Milanese society. She had known everyone worth knowing for 50 years, and she had outlasted most of them. She was not the kind of woman who gestured to people across a room. But she had gestured to Sophia. Their conversation was brief and quiet, the kind of exchange that looks, from across the room, like nothing more than two women being polite. The Contessa said something close to Sophia's ear. Sophia nodded once, slowly. The Contessa's eyes were warm in a way they were not warm for most people. Luca saw this exchange from across the room, and it bothered him more than the sitting had. He excused himself from his table and crossed the hall. He approached with a smile already in place, the kind of smile that had opened doors and closed mouths for 20 years. He introduced himself. He said his name with the full expectation of the reaction his name always produced, the slight widening of eyes, the adjustment in posture, the shift in someone's voice when they realized who they were speaking to. Sophia looked at him with a polite, blank expression and said it was nice to meet him. That was all. No change in her face. No shift in her posture. No recognition. Something moved inside Luca that he was not proud of and did not examine. He began talking. And as he talked, his voice got a little louder, because nearby guests had turned slightly in their direction, and Luca had spent his whole life knowing exactly where his audience was. He looked at her dress and remarked, with a tilted smile, that it looked like something from the previous year's collections. He said it conversationally, as though he was simply making an observation about the weather. Then he said, with exaggerated puzzlement, that he was curious how she had ended up at an event like this one. He wondered aloud, with the same performed smile, whether the City Health Board had begun giving out charity seats to its administrative assistants as a kind of bonus. There was laughter from the people standing nearby. Not the kind of laughter that comes from something funny, but the careful, uncomfortable laughter of people who wanted to stay on the right side of a powerful man. A few guests looked away. One woman touched her companion's arm and turned her back. Marco, standing a short distance behind Luca, went very still. Sophia did not flinch. She did not look down. She did not go red in the face or press her lips together or do any of the things that people do when they are trying to hold themselves together. She simply reached forward and set her glass of sparkling water on the edge of a nearby table. She set it down the way a person sets something down when they have decided something, not with anger, not with haste, but with the calm precision of someone who is choosing their next move rather than reacting to someone else's last one. She looked at Luca Ferrante directly. Not with hostility, not with fear. Just directly. "You should enjoy the rest of your evening, Mr. Ferrante," she said. Then she turned and walked away. The room watched her go. Luca laughed. He said something to the people around him that made them laugh too, and he returned to his table, and the conversation picked up again. But Marco had not laughed. Marco stood behind Luca's chair and looked at the far side of the room, and his eyes did not settle. 40 minutes passed. Marco noticed two things that Luca did not. The first was that Contessa Ilara di Fontana had left the gala. The Contessa never left early. She was the kind of woman who stayed until the last glass was cleared, because leaving early was, in her view, a form of rudeness. But she had walked to the entrance, paused for just a moment with her hand on the door, glanced back once toward the center of the room with an expression that Marco could not read, and disappeared into the night. The second was that 3 men in plain dark suits had entered the hall. They were not on the guest list. Marco knew the list well, but security had let them in without hesitation, which meant they had credentials that security understood. The 3 men did not take drinks from the passing trays. They did not join any conversations. They moved to 3 separate positions near the exits and the main entrance, and they stood still in the way that only trained professionals stand still, not awkwardly, not obviously, but with a kind of quiet readiness that was almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Marco leaned close to Luca. "We should think about leaving," he said quietly. Luca did not look up from his conversation with Greco. "We are closing a deal," he said. "We are not going anywhere." Across the room, near the window where she had spoken with the Contessa, Sofia Marchetti stood with her back to the wall and her head tilted very slightly to one side. If anyone had looked closely, they might have seen a thin wire running from beneath her hair to a small piece fitted behind her ear. She was speaking into it. Her lips barely moved. Her expression gave nothing away. She had been speaking into it, at different moments throughout the evening, since she arrived. The deal that Luca was finalizing with Greco at the center table, the €50 million construction contract that was the reason tonight mattered, had never been a real deal. Greco was not a property developer. He had been cooperating with investigators for 6 months, and every conversation he had with Luca over that period had been recorded. Tonight was the last piece. Tonight, Luca would say the final things that needed to be said, in a room full of witnesses, and the case would be complete. It had taken 3 years to build. Sofia had started working on it before this gala had even been planned. She had mapped the shell companies, traced the money through 4 countries, identified the officials who had been pressured into approving contracts they should have rejected, and assembled a record so thorough and so careful that there was not a single gap a lawyer could crawl through. She had done all of it quietly. Without announcement. Without anyone in this building knowing who she really was. The main doors opened. A man in evening wear walked in. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair and the measured walk of someone who had spent decades being the most serious person in every room he entered. He was not in uniform, because tonight did not call for uniforms. Tonight called for precision, and precision did not need a costume. He was Director Rinaldi, the head of Interpol's Financial Crimes Division in Italy. He was also Sofia Marchetti's superior. He walked across the hall without hurrying, without looking around. He stopped beside Sofia. He reached into his jacket and took out a slim leather folder. He held it out to her. He called her Director Marchetti. Not Ms. Marchetti. Not Sofia. Not Junior Administrator. Director. The word moved through the nearby conversations like a stone dropped into calm water. The ripples went outward. Heads turned. People who had been talking stopped. The woman at table 14, the woman in the plain dress who had been laughed at an hour ago, stood beside the head of an Interpol division and received a document from his hands, and he spoke to her the way you speak to someone who is above you. Sofia opened the folder. She looked at the document inside for exactly 3 seconds. She nodded. She closed it and handed it back. Then she turned toward the center of the hall. She walked across the marble floor in the same unhurried way she had walked away from Luca Ferrante earlier that evening. She reached the central table. Luca looked up, and his face arranged itself into the smile he used for interruptions. The smile did not hold when he saw what was in her eyes. She told him, in a clear and even voice, that he was being detained. She stated the charges: organized criminal conspiracy, money laundering across 4 jurisdictions, coercion of public officials. She told him that the deal he had been working to close all evening had been a controlled arrangement from the beginning, and that the men sitting across the table from him had been cooperating with investigators for the past 6 months. Luca did not move. He sat in his chair at the most important table in the room, and he did not move, because there was nothing to do. The exits had been standing arrangements for 40 minutes. The room had witnesses. The record was complete. There was no version of this evening that ended differently than this. Marco stepped back slowly, carefully, and placed his hands where the agents near the door could see them clearly. He had survived 20 years because he always knew when something was finished. The agents moved in quietly. There were no raised voices. There was no scene. Sofia had designed the end of this evening the same way she had designed every part of it, with the minimum amount of noise required to accomplish the necessary thing. As Luca was guided toward the exit, he passed close to where Sofia was standing. He looked at her. He looked at the plain dress and the pulled-back hair and the unremarkable woman he had mocked in front of 100 people just over an hour ago, and something moved across his face that was not anger and was not denial. It was the specific and terrible feeling of understanding something too late. He had said what he said in front of witnesses. Those same witnesses were standing in this room right now, watching him leave. Sophia watched him go. When he was through the door, she turned and walked back to table 14. Her glass of sparkling water was still on the edge of the nearby table where she had set it down. She picked it up and drank what was left in it. A young assistant who had been helping with the investigation came to her side. He had been watching the evening unfold from the back of the room, and his face was full of the kind of energy that comes from seeing something finish well after a very long time. "How long had you been watching him?" he asked. Sophia set the glass down on the table one more time. "Since before he noticed me," she said. That was the point. The gala continued. The music came back. Waiters moved through the room again. People who had gone quiet began talking once more, though their conversations were different now, lower, more careful, full of the particular awareness that comes from watching something real happen in a room where everything is usually just performance. Near the entrance, two women who had laughed at Luca's joke about the city health board stood close together. One of them said, quietly, that Luca Ferrante had humiliated the wrong woman tonight. The other one shook her head. "No," she said. "He humiliated exactly the right woman. That was always going to be his last mistake." Outside the Grand Palazzo Rossetti, the city of Milan continued as it always did, busy and bright and completely unaware that in a marble hall with chandeliers and polished floors, a man who had spent 20 years believing he was untouchable had just learned what patience, in the hands of the right person, is truly capable of.